Uela, uela raga, come state ragazzi? Benvenuti in un nuovo video bilingue. Welcome to a new bilingual video, everybody. Oggi vorrei parlarvi di un argomento come sempre, è qualcosa che mi interessa molto del mondo italiano, del mondo italo-americano. E quindi oggi parleremo un po' della Chiesa cattolica, essere cattolico in un contesto italo-americano. Anche vorrei paragonare questa realtà che ho vissuto in prima persona, quindi come sempre vi parlo dal mio punto di vista e dall'esperienza che io ho vissuto in prima persona, first hand, in prima persona. E sì, quindi non mi ricordo che altro vi volevo dire, però sarà un video bilingue, so I'll be switching between English and Italian. And throughout the journey, lungo il percorso, throughout, lungo, you can kind of say in a way, lungo il percorso, throughout the journey, vi condividerò vocaboli utili. I'll share with you guys useful vocaboli utili, useful vocab. In Italian, we have vocabolario and vocaboli are two words we can use, a singular and plural. So I never thought, though, if vocaboli is the plural of vocabolario. I believe it is. Vocabolario, vocaboli? No, they're two different forms of the word. I just never paid that much attention to it, to be quite honest. But the point that I wanted to get to was, in Italian, I believe in English, we call it an uncountable noun, I'm pretty sure. Because vocabulary is a singular word that can refer to a group. And yeah, in Italian, though, we can have vocabolario, but then there's vocabolo and vocaboli. I've got to look into that a little more. This is exactly what I mean when I talk about if you can't explain something, that's the item that you need to look into. That's how I study everything. And even when you get to my level, I'm a teacher. You still run into things that you're like, wait a second, I never questioned that. I just kind of go with the flow. I know what the word is, when to use it. That's enough. But then when you actually have to explain it, è lì dove le cose cambiano. It's there where things change. È lì dove le cose cambiano. It's there where things change. So anyway, coming back to our little intro, e poi andremo avanti, and then we'll move on. We're going to have a bilingual video today, un video bilingue. I'll point out useful vocaboli quando escono fuori, when they come out, when they come about. And we're going to talk about Catholicism in the way that I experienced it as an Italian American, and how I've also experienced it in the Italian American versus Italian context. Now, obviously, ovviamente, anytime you talk about something that is cultural or something that is religious based, you could talk about this for un'eternità. For an eternity, un'eternità, and still just barely scratch the surface. You know, I would say, like, for that in Italian, solo stare sulla superficie, something to that extent. I would say superficie, because superficie is surface. It's not coming to me right now. Non mi viene in mente. It's not coming to mind right now the specific equivalent, the equivalent for scratch the surface in Italian, but you know, sulla superficie. Something to that effect. Qualcosa del genere. Qualcosa del genere can mean something like that, something to that effect, something of that sort. So yeah, anytime you talk about these topics, they're huge. You can go in any direction. What I'm going to do is just simply talk from my experience on a couple points that stick out to me and use those as examples to share this story with you guys, all right? So as always, we're going to have a little bit of story time. I love being a raccontatore, I believe we could say in Italian, un raccontatore, a storyteller. I believe in French we use the word also in English, like racontateur, something like that. But yet again, I haven't looked that word up in forever, so it's not coming very fresh, but I can kind of get somewhere close to it. I think this is also a good exercise just to see how I work through translations. We're doing this all verbally, obviously. I'm not writing anything down, but it's useful just to see the inner workings of one's mind as they're going through something like this, which is an experience we all share. We're all trying to figure out how to say things in diverse lingue, in different or other languages. Cool, va bene. Quindi vi parlo un po' di quello che ho capito da piccolo e come ho visto le cose evolvere e cambiare negli anni. So I'll begin with when I was small, how I first came to understand this, and then how I saw it evolve and change over the course of time. So I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s. And during that time, my experience being Catholic was what some people in Catholic circles will call the felt banner Catholicism. If you're like in Catholic circles, you'll know what I'm talking about. It was the felt banner Catholicism, the guitar playing Catholicism with maybe a tambourine or a flute or, something different. It wasn't the very traditional Catholicism, quindi non era quello che stiamo vedendo attualmente in questo periodo dove molta gente sta andando nella direzione molto tradizionale, tipo con la messa in latino e queste cose così. So what we're seeing right now, at least in the United States, the Catholic Church, or people that are very Catholic and are really living by the faith, tend to go more in the traditional route. You may hear people use words like trad, which come from traditional. They're going more towards the Latin Mass route and stuff like that. And there's a whole culture and lifestyle associated with that brand of American Catholicism or Catholicism in general. But this is also un punto molto interessante. It's also a very interesting point to compare the experience of one growing up Catholic in an Italian community in the US and then trying to understand that with your coetanei, with your people of your same age. There's a word in English, I can't remember it, ma I tuoi coetanei, so people of your same age in Italia. Because this goes back to a point, and I know I was just starting to talk about the way the music was and the felt banners and stuff. We'll get back to that. But there is this idea, and it's worth bringing up now, we're going to talk about it anyway. I think that there is an idea in a lot of Italian American communities that to be really Italian American is also to be really Catholic. You really lean into going to Mass on Sundays and following, I don't want to necessarily say follow the religion in a very dogmatic way, because in my observation, it feels more cultural than purely Catholic, but I think there's this idea that they should pray the rosary, they should wear a cross, they should be very forthright with the fact that they are Catholic. And the interesting thing, la cosa molto interessante, which I believe I already shared before, credo di avervelo già detto. Look at that right there. Credo di avervelo già detto. Credo di avervelo già detto. I believe that I already said this to you guys. So un punto interessante is the thing I believe I already shared with you. Credo di avervelo già detto. Check out our videos on double object pronouns in the congiuntivo to know how that construction came about. I'll link it down below. But it's very interesting when you then rivolgerti agli italiani, when you then address Italians, you talk to Italians, and you see that their real idea of being Italian, a true form of an Italian, the archetype, if you will, is not necessarily to be very Catholic. And so I think it's really an Italian-American thing to have this idea of like, I'm going to Mass, I'm a Catholic person, I'm Italian. That actually feels much more American than Italian itself. So this is going to lead us to that story. I'm kind of jumping around. Hope you're still able to follow, but it's okay. It doesn't have to be a perfect line from childhood, teenage, all the way through. So c'era una volta. C'era una volta è un modo per dire once upon a time in italiano. C'era una volta. Però vi sto parlando di una cosa che veramente è successo nella mia vita. So I'm talking about something that really did happen in my life. Era Domenica delle Palme. It was Palm Sunday, Domenica delle Palme. And I'm talking to one of my Italian relatives. And I tell him, oh, did you get your palms? Or was it Ash Wednesday? Maybe I'm confused. But point is, it had something to do with the palms. So it could be Ash Wednesday, because it's supposed to be that the palms are burned to create the ashes. Could have been Ash Wednesday, mercoledì delle ceneri. Mercoledì delle ceneri. Or it could have been Domenica delle Palme. I can't remember. It was many years ago. But I was like a teenager. Ero un adolescente. And I go to my cousin, hey, happy Palm Sunday. Buona Domenica delle Palme. Because I had this understanding as a small child that Italian meant Catholic. And so therefore, if it's Palm Sunday, you acknowledge and celebrate Palm Sunday and went to church to get your palms or went to church to get your ashes. That was just sort of the default I had in my brain. Se era vero o falso, oggettivamente parlando, non si può più capire. You know, if that was honestly the truth or false, how can we know? It's when I was little, it's just the perception I had around me. That's just what I thought. And I remember my cousin said, no, cioè è da tanto che non vado alla messa. È da tanto che non vado alla messa, he said. Oh, it's been forever since I last went to Mass. I think in English we say more church, like the last time I went to church. But in Italian, because messa is sort of ubiquitous with, I think that's the word, right? It's sort of one and the same with going to church, at least in a large, generally speaking way. They just say I didn't go to Mass. I don't know if in English often we would say I didn't go to Mass. You would say I didn't go to church. Because the US is more traditionally Protestant. But anyway, moving on. And he said, did you? And I was like, yeah, I got my palms. It's Palm Sunday or whatever. And he's like, sei molto credente. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. So this, you know, you're always learning as you're talking to people. Non capivo che cosa significasse. I didn't understand what that meant. Or non ho capito che cosa volesse dire. Yeah, it's another way of saying it too. And later on, I looked it up, and later on I asked somebody, what does credente mean? Because you sort of do a judgment call. You don't always want to interrupt the flow of the conversation and be like, what does that mean? Sometimes you just kind of want to run with it. You kind of like can understand what it means in the context. I then later on understood what it meant. I probably asked someone else. To be molto credente is a way of saying, like, you're very religious. It's one way of saying that in Italian. Obviously, you could say sei molto religioso. But sei molto credente means like you're a person of faith. You're a faithful person. You're a believer. It's basically like saying you're a believer. And I thought that was just an interesting way to put it because I didn't associate going to Palm Sunday and participating in that aspect of Catholic life as meaning you are credente. So this could be that one relative's perception, okay? This is all anecdotal. This is not a scientific study. Non è un studio scientifico. Un studio scientifico. It's not a scientific study. È un aneddoto. It's an anecdote. But based on that experience, I like to draw some conclusions. E quindi per arrivare alla conclusione di questa esperienza, era molto interessante per me da italo-americano rivolgermi a un italiano con il sospetto che gli italiani sono molto cattolici, sono molto credenti, che vanno alla messa, la Chiesa fa parte fondamentale della vita. Io lo dico oggi a voi e capisco quanto è sbagliato, cioè quanto non è accurate. It's really not accurate to paint with broad strokes and say Italians, you know, because Italy is the motherland, la patria, la madre patria, the motherland of all things Italian, that's where everything Italian flows from, that therefore, if in the United States, in our context, we view being very Catholic and very Italian as one and the same, that they're going to be the same way. And this unraveling of preconceived notions or preconceptions happens like over and over and over again when you grow up in an Italian-American context and then you go to Italy, you talk to Italians, you become a part of Italian life, you see just how much distance, quanta distanza c'è, just how much distance there really is between Italian-American and Italian. And then you start to understand that Italian-American really is just American, but with an Italian flavor of the past that has evolved and is sort of still negotiating what it is at this time in the present day. So you start to really see, there's a lot of daylight between this. I believe in Italian we can say, c'è molta luce fra le due cose. I'm pretty sure. It's just not coming to me right away. Today, I'm in just, the brain is what it is, Today, I'm in that mood where I'm saying things that I normally don't say. They're kind of coming to me. They're not super clear. That happens. Succede. This is the life of a language learner. It's what happens. So I just remember that was one of those moments where you just have something unraveled where you're like, oh, there are a lot of differences here, and it is not the same. There is also then a larger concept one could dig more into. I have not spent that much time in it really, but religion and faith at large in the U.S. is a different concept to religion and faith in Europe. I have some theories. As I said, I haven't worked them out tremendously yet. One theory that I have is that the church as an institution was so much more presente e oppressiva nella vita degli europei per secoli. So the church as an institution, I believe, was much more sort of oppressive is the word that comes to me. It doesn't feel that way when I say opprimente in Italian. Oppressiva, maybe. Opprimente, it just feels like it's very present and had a big role in everyday life. And I think there's sort of this reaction in Europe at large to kind of be like more humanist. Yet again, I'm throwing out a lot of stuff without backing it up, okay? Whereas in the US, it's all about religious liberty, and we don't have one religion for the whole country where the church was running everything, and sort of related with the Pope and the kings, and it's just different. The New World is very different, and there's a whole concept called the Protestant work ethic. I think Max Weber is a German economist or philosopher that spoke about it. I was kind of researching that for a little bit, where there's this idea that like capitalism and Protestantism sort of go hand in hand with the rising up of the individual instead of the collective. Catholicism is much more about the collective. It's more about, I'm getting deep for a second, okay? It's more about traditionally you go to church because you are illiterate, you don't speak Latin, but the priest speaks Latin and is literate and reads the gospel to you, and you just believe what the priest says. But when Martin Luther came around and started translating the Bible into German, and then people started going more to school, and the North was much more industrial than the South of Europe, which was more agrarian, it was warmer, it's colder, darker in the North of Europe, and Protestantism spread, industrialization spread, and so they're more individualistic, not as much about the community. These are like things I'm just throwing out, okay? Food for thought. They can all be elaborated. Possono essere più elaborate. They can all be further worked on. Elaborate. But once you kind of start dabbling in this stuff, things start making a lot more sense. What's going on in the US versus in Italy. They're just not the same way when it comes to faith. And then there's other parts of the US. We traditionally speak about the Bible Belt. The south of the U.S., we have a very strong evangelical, non-denominational Christian church thing in the U.S. culture. So there's just a lot more going on church-wise in the U.S. than there tends to be in Europe. Now, that doesn't mean we can fare di tutta l'erba un fascio. We can't, just make of all the grass one little, everything of the same size. We can't paint with broad strokes. This is just what I've sort of observed in my own experience. So now let's just go back for a moment to what I was sharing con la mia infancia, with my childhood. Because that's always what everybody really enjoys, right? Even when I watch my videos back, I'm like, I much enjoy when you talk about childhood rather than everything else. Because the other stuff is so new and attuale. It's so current. It's like it's always easier to talk about the past because you've got hindsight. You know what I mean? So we're going to need at least a good 20 years till I could start really talking about what's happening now, So growing up in an Italian-American community, growing up Catholic, as I mentioned, it was the Catholic Church of the 90s and 2000s. It was felt banners. If you're in Catholic circles, you probably know what that means. It was very much a cultural thing. And so while it is a religious thing, it's also a cultural thing. And so I never really thought that much or gave that much consideration to the church because you're born into it. You are a cradle Catholic. It's just kind of a part of life. And everyone else in your community is doing the same thing. Fai il battesimo quando I tuoi amici di classe fanno il battesimo. Quando sei piccolino, battesimo is a baptism. Fai la comunione, primo comunione. I think it's primo, not prima. Or is it la prima comunione? Comunione. When you're in second grade is when we all did it with your classmates. So I'm there with my classmates in the church doing the rehearsal for la comunione, la reconciliazione, reconciliation. Then la cresima. La cresima is confirmation. So you're all doing these things together that it doesn't feel like a thing. It only started feeling like a thing when you're out of that cycle of being in school and you're making your sacraments, I sacramenti. Only then if you choose on, by your own volition is the word coming to mind. Se tu decidi di andare alla messa, se tu decidi di andare alla domenica, allora lì vedrai le differenze. So then if you decide going outside of that sacrament school life world, if you then decide to go to church, you're most likely not going to see your coetanei any longer at Mass. And that was what I observed in my experience, that once you were out of that world where your parents were making you do it, and you're a minor, you're a child, you don't drive yet, you don't have that libertà, quella autonomia, that liberty, that freedom, and that autonomy, they don't go to church anymore. And so that's why I think in my experience, being Italian American, being a part of the church, is really seen during the sacrament time. Because now that I'm older, I'm in my early 30s now, so people my age, a lot of them are getting married, they're having children. And it's interesting now to see how many Italian Americans of my age, they want to get married in the church. They have to do the pre-cena, which is like, for anyone that's not familiar with it, it's a sort of marriage counseling before you get married. They do the pre-cena, they have to meet with the priest, they get married in the church. When it's time for their children, once their children are born, they want to get them baptized. And what was interesting is I heard from people in the diocese, like the people that run the diocese, around the bishop, let's say. I had heard recently that they said, we do a lot of weddings, we do a lot of baptisms, but those individuals do not convert into mass-goers that are then contributing to the church. And we're not getting into Catholicism as a faith. I'm talking more about the cultural side of it and what I experienced in an Italian-American way. So we're not talking about the dogma, the beliefs, Catholicism as a faith. I'm talking about it more as a part of your cultural life, is what I wanted to say. Your cultural life, la tua vita, la tua cultura. And so I noticed that, to me, it seemed interesting because the older I've gotten personally, and I'm doing all this studying as I'm telling you guys, right? Like I'm on the more academic side of all things Italian because I really took to this. Mi piace davvero tanto l'italianità. I really love Italianness. And so I'm interested in absorbing all parts of it, including something like the religious history or cultural religion, right? Cultural Catholicism. So I'm interested in looking into this stuff. And so what ends up happening when you start digging deeper and deeper, just as I mentioned, you grow up with these ideas that Italians are very Catholic. And then you're like, yes, but it's in my estimation, more of a cultural Catholicism rather than like in the American context, you look at like an evangelical Christian. They're two different things. So in studying that, the idea then came to my head, l'idea mi è venuta in mente, well, so then would going to church then imply that then you're practicing the faith, praticante, You're a practitioner, you practice it. And that's the difference, where some are comfortable with cultural Catholicism and some want to be practicing Catholics. They can obviously have crossover, people go in and out. Faith is a very complex thing, and everyone is on their own faith journey, so we're not here to talk about that. It's strictly cultural stuff. But me as an observer, qualcuno che studia queste cose. Lo trovo molto interessante. And so that isn't to say that if someone does something more cultural, they don't care about their faith. They may have a quiet, private faith or something. We're not talking about any of that. I'm just simply sharing my observations. So basically, that's what I experienced as a child. I shared with you what happened when I got older, and I started talking to Italians and experiencing this more and more and more with Italians. I was like, that's really interesting. And then now what I'm seeing as what I call a young adult, not the young adult when you're like 18. I'm saying like I'm now properly in adulthood, but it's like people are still starting to do adulting. You know what I mean? So that's what I mean by a younger adult. I'm still a younger adult. So it's now interesting to see that shift in what's happening. And I touched on in the beginning of this video, there's also a shift in those who want to be more faithful, more of a practicing Catholic rather than a cultural Catholic or a cradle Catholic. The direction they're going in, they're becoming more and more traditionally Catholic because that is a direction that the church on a whole is going in. And so it's interesting to observe that, but I think that largely when we think of Italian American, and for people that don't study it, they think, oh, Italian Catholic, or you'll hear people in the northeast of the US say, oh, you're Irish Catholic. There are just these terms that people use, not in the academic world, okay? So we're just out in public, out in the world. And I was going to say with lay people, because we're talking about church stuff. So the lay people. Not i sacerdoti. Sacerdoti is like saying those of the religious life, but meaning like nuns, brothers, monks, priests, stuff like that. Just because the terminology mi viene in mente, that kind of terminology is coming to mind. So it's very interesting to observe. That is the understanding that I have. And I spoke a little bit about this in my video on St. Joseph's Day and Zeppole and Italian American communities, which I'll share down below in the description if you guys are interested in checking out that video. And un altro video bilingue. But anytime I talk more about Italian American things, I lean a little bit more on the English side because the Italian American community speaks English. And so it just feels natural to speak more English if I'm talking about something that involves the Italian American community rather than più italiano, rather than more Italian. So I think to conclude, I would say it is not accurate to say that being the archetype of an Italian American means to be very Catholic. Because if we're using the definition that Catholic è un cattolico praticante, as a practicing Catholic, then I would say not everybody. I think the archetype of an Italian American that is very Catholic is more one who cares about the church existing, playing a part in overall life culturally, being a part of the community. Like they don't want to see the church close, you know? If the church were in trouble, they'd probably all get together and try to donate to keep it open. Perhaps. You know, but they still want to have baptisms. They still want to do the communions. There was a time when people were doing very huge parties. I never experienced that. I was never in those circles, so I don't know what that's like. But there are situations where people will say to me, oh, you're going to a baptism this weekend. Is there a DJ? Is it like, how many people are going? Like 300 people? And personally, in my life, I don't experience that, so I don't know what that's like. I have been to big weddings. I've been to many weddings. But I haven't ever been to a big baptism or a big confirmation or a big communion. And I just am not in those circles, I think is the easiest way to explain it. Just that hasn't been my lived experience, so I can't talk about that. All right. So I think this is interesting. Secondo me è molto interessante. Fatemi sapere cosa ne pensate. Spero che abbiate imparato qualcosa di nuovo e anche spero che abbiate apprezzato vedere questo punto di vista da qualcuno che è cresciuto in un contesto italo-americano negli anni 90, inizi 2000 e come io ho capito come queste cose funzionano. So, yeah, guys. That's going to be it from me today, and I'll catch you guys all in the next video. Sound good? Va bene, ragazzi. Alla prossima. Ciao. Ciao.